All right, joining us on the program right now, very pleased to have with us Mr. Mike Karn from the Federal Flight Deck Officers Association and the Coalition of Airline Pilots Association. Mike, good evening, sir. Thanks for coming on the program tonight.
Good evening. How are you doing this evening?
I'm great. Dr. A.W.R. Hawkins, who is a frequent guest on this program, had a piece in the Daily Caller yesterday talking about Congressman Chip Kravac, who was asking the question, what if our pilots had been armed on 9/11? And he says, on Friday, I spoke with Congressman Kravac about the approaching end of the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program, and he spelled out in no uncertain terms exactly what is at stake here. He described pilots as the last line of defense, armed pilots as the last line of defense, and he talked at length about having such pilots in the sky keeps would-be terrorists trapped in, quote, a guessing game. But Janet Napolitano wants to phase out the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program based on her belief that there are more important, quote, risk-based airline security measures towards which federal money could be applied. Mike, is this a correct status right now for the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program? Is the future of this program really in jeopardy?
I believe it is, particularly when you look at the budget that's been put aside for the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program. Back in 2003, when this became law, the budget was about $22 million. You started there with a handful of Federal Flight Deck officers, and now you're all the way up to several thousand that participate in this program at their own expense. By cutting this budget in half, which is already a small budget, which already prevented new volunteers from participating, you're going to significantly hamper this as a line of defense. And I believe it's only one more step towards eliminating the program. And quite frankly, that was not the intent of Congress. I see no end in the intent of Congress when they passed this law to require the pilots to be armed.
Well, I mean, it certainly seems like, this is a program that is, no pun intended, flown under the radar for a lot of folks out there in the country. This has not been a program that I think many people are even aware of, much less the scope of this program with more than 13,000 armed pilots currently in this country. And I don't know that this has ever been polled, but I'm guessing if you asked the American people, we've got this Federal Flight Deck Officer Program. It had a budget of $25 million a year. We've got 13,000 armed pilots. Would you like to see more? And do you think this is a waste of government money? I'm guessing you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody saying, oh, yeah, cut this program. This has got to go. I mean, I'm fairly certain we can find government programs that are like feeding bourbon to mice that are spending more money than the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program is right now.
You're right on the money on this case. I mean, this is the most cost-effective anti-terrorism element out there. This per flight, it costs the federal government $15 a flight to put a Federal Flight Deck officer on a flight. It costs them, on the other hand, about $3,300 to put a federal air marshal on a flight. I'm nothing against the federal air marshals. I love them. I'm glad when they're on board our aircraft, and I enjoy having the professional federal air marshals on board my aircraft when I am flying as a pilot. But clearly in this case, this is a very cost-effective program. It is the last line of defense. And to the question that you asked earlier, had a Federal Flight Deck officer been on board that aircraft, yes, I do believe that would have prevented those aircraft from being taken over and being used as a weapon of mass destruction. I truly believe that. So when you look at the cost, and you say, well, we can eliminate this and take $10 million away. Well, what is $10 million in any budget in the federal government?
Right.
But then what was the premise? What was the reasoning that they put behind why they wanted to do it? They said, well, we have all these other we have all these not necessarily cost-effective measures, but we screen passengers 100%. Well, let's be honest about that. How many Inspector General reports have we seen from Homeland Security that say things are getting through? I see reports all the time that things are still getting through. Things are still being found on aircraft. No system is perfect. That's why we have to have backups. We can't rely upon a system right now that we say has screened everybody. We still know things are getting through. You even look in the case of drugs being smuggled on aircraft. That's still happening. So if people can get drugs, people can get weapons, we're still in jeopardy. You need to keep each of these lines of defense in place, period.
Talking with Mike Karn from the Federal Flight Deck Officers Association. And, Mike, again, with the budget request or the spending request, submitted by President Obama. You say that the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program has allies in Congress. What are the chances, given the fact that the president has basically chosen to make Congress his enemy in this reelection campaign, what are the chances that Congress can do anything to save the FFDO program?
Well, it's interesting. About 4 months ago, we were already talking to both sides of the aisle in the House, and we were having a discussion with them about, hey, we have over 700 people that want to participate in the program, new volunteers. Could we at least get the funding for that? And they were interested in doing that, very much so interested. That's why this is such a blindside coming from the administration. Why in the world would you want to do this when you still have people in line to participate in this? It just doesn't make sense.
Well, no, it really doesn't. I mean, it seems like the interest among pilots is still very high, despite the fact that this is kind of it's not kind of, it's a pain in the neck for a pilot to actually become a federal flight deck officer. What's the process like for somebody who says, all right, you know what, I want to go through the training, I want to be able to carry a firearm in the cockpit?
Basically, they apply to the program. There's an extensive written application that's screened by TSA/DHS, Department of Homeland Security and Transportation Security Agency. Then what happens is the individual federal flight deck officer will go through a battery of psychological tests, be interviewed by a psychologist, and then from that point, if they're approved, they'll go ahead and participate in the training. They'll receive training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And then you go through a continuing process for each federal flight deck officer for requalifying with their sidearm, their issued weapon every 6 months, and redeputization about every 3 to 5 years with another course. But it's an extensive process that each pilot who wants to volunteer for that goes through this to ensure the quality, to ensure that this person can participate physically, and they've even been screened mentally. I don't know any other volunteer force that goes through something like this.
Yeah.
These are true patriots willing to spend over 6 years of their over 6 years, they spend on average of about $10,000. This is each pilot to participate. So if the federal government's funding $22 million a year, if you were to take $10,000 and multiply it times the total number of federal flight deck officers, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that the pilots are paying to protect this country. That's what doesn't make sense with this administration.
Yeah. Yeah, and going back to this story in the Daily Caller, Representative Kravac from Minnesota and his concerns about this, he says the FFDOs take time off from their work to go to training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy, and they train on a bi-yearly basis on their own, as you say, and as a result, it basically costs taxpayers $15 a flight to have an armed pilot on board. You talk about the cost effectiveness of this. I think again the practicality of this cannot be understated as well. I think again most travelers would feel better about the idea of a pilot being the last line of defense and the pilot being able to protect the cockpit from an attack. God help us if there is another attempt. I know I'd feel a lot better knowing that there was an armed pilot on board.
Well, they talk about the reinforced doors. Well, let's be honest. The reinforced doors open and close.
Right.
It's on 9/11. While the doors were open, in some cases, while the doors were closed, they were compromised. People got into the cockpit, took it over. You can't rely upon that. You can't say, well, this is the final line. If you have another line to protect yourself, why wouldn't you do that? And particularly something that's this inexpensive. But let's get to Congressman Kravac. You want to talk about he is our one member of Congress that I am aware of that had participated in this program. So when you're talking to somebody, you're talking to somebody who's walked a mile in the federal flight deck officer's shoes. You're talking to somebody who has been that last line of defense. So when the questioning came up at a hearing with the Homeland Security Secretary, he challenged her on several issues. He goes, no, that is not the last line of defense. That is a man that would know. That's a man who's walked a mile in the federal flight deck officer's shoes and understands what's going on there, and Congressman Kravac.
Talking with Mike Carn again from the Federal Flight Deck Officers Association and the Coalition of Airline Pilots Association. So At this point, Mike, I mean, can public pressure help at all?
Absolutely. I would encourage every one of your listeners to contact their senators, contact their congressmen, and ask them to support this program. This is such a small part, an incredibly minute part when you consider the billions of dollars that's being spent. And this is something where a small investment from the federal government actually returns hundreds of millions of dollars of investment from the pilots that are paying to participate in it. Tell them to call to preserve this program. Pilots carried weapons, carried sidearms to protect the mail on board aircraft for years. It was part of the federal aviation regulations, and that disappeared sometime in the late 90s off of the books. This has been historically something that pilots have done, and it came back after 9/11 because of those horrible attacks and that massive loss of life. This is not the time to start taking apart our security. This is the time where we need to keep things in place. We're a lot more vigilant than we were before. But let's not assume that we're infallible now and things can't get through.
Just out of curiosity, Mike, what do the airlines themselves have to say about this, and are they supportive of the FFDO program?
The airlines, for the most part, are supportive because it's, as you said, not a lot of people have heard about it. Have heard about the program. That means they're quiet professionals as FFDOs that are operating out there.
Right.
You don't hear about a program, but you know it's protecting you. Then you know it's effective. But for the airlines, for the most part, they do support it. Now, in the law itself, it said things are to be done. If the program's going to operate, it's going to operate at no cost to the airlines. So there are difficulties at times for pilots who want to get the time off. And by getting time off, they just say, hey, for this trip, don't pay me so I can go train. There are times when it's difficult to maneuver with the airline on that. But for the most part, I've heard at times airlines wishing that they had federal flight deck officers on certain flights when they know there's a security threat. I have heard that from different airlines. I can't say which ones for security reasons, but I have heard that. So there is some support out there for this program.
Well, that's good to hear, Mike. And listen, I hope that as the public becomes more aware, not just of the program itself, but of the challenges and the threats that it faces, that they're going to get involved. They're going to let their voices be heard. Again, in a spending proposal that carries with it $1 trillion deficit, slashing the federal flight deck officer program, one of the more cost-effective parts of government, just seems like a really clueless thing for this administration to do.
It really speaks to not an understanding of what's happening on the front line. And what's happening on the front line is we still have cracks. We still have openings where things are getting through. If you're going to stand in front of Congress and say, no, we're doing this and we're screening 100% of the people and claim that things aren't getting through, that's just not right. You can read the Inspector General reports from DHS. You know things are going to get through. It's a human system. It's going to happen. Therefore, you need to back it up.
Mike Carn, thanks again for coming on the program, sir. Great talking to you. Hope we can do it again soon.
And thank you to all the NRA listeners and their support. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much, sir.
You bet. Mike Carn joining us tonight here on Cam and Company.